Good evening, everybody, and welcome here. And what I think is going to be a very interesting discussion. Our two guests tonight, Karen Greenberg, the editor of this rather extraordinary book and wonderful book, The Least Worst Place, executive director of the Center for Law and Security at New York University, and previously editor of the torture papers, which some of you may well have seen, about Abu Ghraib. And interrogating her tonight, Peter Clarke, formerly head of counter-terrorism at New Scotland Yard, now consultant in private practice, and also a member of the recently formed National Security Forum. Peter also, and I think it's extremely relevant for the discussion tonight, from the beginning of 2004 onwards, made a series of visits, 11 visits in total, to Washington as a member of a UK delegation which went to the States to negotiate the terms for the release or the return, really, of UK citizens and residents who are being held in Guantanamo. So had direct dealings with the US administration over the whole issue of Guantanamo. He's also, I should add, a fellow at the Center for Law and Security at New York University. Now, Karen's book, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to have a look at it, but I just want to set out a little bit of the background for you, just so that to make this conversation a little bit more coherent, I think, this evening. And I want to really draw to your attention a number of kind of signposts along the road that will act as markers, in a sense. This book covers a very discrete period in the history of Guantanamo, and is very important just for that reason. It's a matter of a few months at the beginning, and looking at that, I think, is a very, very instructive process. And what Karen has done, I'm actually going to sue Karen, because although she pretends to be a lawyer, actually she's done a journalist job. And us journalists are very, very protective of our profession, and we don't allow interlopers to come in, but she's done a fantastic job, a fantastic journalistic job, if that's not a discrediting of her work. And I want to say that really, if we want to think of a number of dates, there's a number of important dates which you don't have to remember these in detail, but November the 13th, 2001, only a month or two after 9/11, a military order is issued. This order is called the Detention, Treatment and Trial of Certain Non-Citizens in the War Against Terror. Okay, this is an extremely important document issued by the administration, and it's effectively, it doesn't grant any legal or procedural checks on the president's proclaimed powers in relation to what can be done with these prisoners. That's the starting point. A couple of weeks later, at Thanksgiving, a gentleman called Pierre Richard Prosper, who's the US State Department's ambassador at large for war crime issues, gets a call and is effectively asked to find somewhere to put the prisoners that at that moment have been swept up on the battlefield in Afghanistan. Nobody knows who they are, what they are, where they're from, or anything about it, but he gets the instruction. And there's a remarkable little scenario that's described in the book, where he's sitting there with his legal advisors, and they're basically trying to think up somewhere that they can take these prisoners. And some lawyer from the State Department, I think it is the State Department, I think it is, suddenly says, oh, how about Guantanamo? And literally, that's almost how and everybody says, yeah, what a great idea. It's not on US territory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all kind of falls into place. So that's the sort of genesis of, we can talk about this, I'm sure it'll be talked about a little bit later. A month later, or less than a month later, we have the appointment of General Michael Lehnert as the head of what is called JTF 160, which is the military unit which is going to be in charge of guarding and, well, he's not quite sure actually, Michael Lehnert, about precisely what he's going to do there, because he doesn't know under what terms, under what legal terms, he's going to be in charge of Guantanamo. Are these prisoners of war? Are they? Who are they? What are they? What laws apply? great deal of uncertainty about that, which comes into the book and is a very important element, in a sense, him trying to make sense of the situation that he's been put into. And just a few days after his appointment, of course, is the first time Rumsfeld, Secretary of State for Defense, announces that Guantanamo is going to be the place where all these prisoners are going to be detained. And it is during the course of announcing that he makes this famous statement right at the beginning of the book here, which gives the book its title, where he says that I would characterize Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, as the least worst place we could have selected. It has disadvantages, as you suggest. Its disadvantages, however, seem to be modest relative to the alternatives. And so the least worst place is where the book gets its title from. And it's also the logo that's on T-shirts when, the beginning of January 2002, Leonard effectively takes up his posting, and Guantanamo is really getting into the swing of things. On the 9th of January 2002, there is a draft legal memo which comes from the Office of the Legal Counsel, which basically says and instructs, in fact, Leonard and everybody else at Guantanamo Bay, that the Geneva Conventions are not going to apply to the prisoners. This puts them in somewhat of a dilemma because they still don't know what actually is going to apply. So there's kind of some sort of chaos which is connected to that, and a certain amount of shenanigans also, because remarkably, a very public-spirited gentleman decides, one of the officers at Guantanamo decides at some point actually to call in the International Committee for the Red Cross and invite them in to inspect the facilities there, much against the administration's desires at the time. In February, the end of February 2003, and just remember how short these timescales are, we have the appointment of Major General Michael Dunlavey to head what's a new task force, which is also going to work at Guantanamo Bay, called JTF 170 as opposed to JTF 160. JTF 170, which is much smaller, there's about 2,000 personnel at JTF 160 and about 100 personnel JTF 170, and their job is basically to interrogate the prisoners. And what the book describes, in a sense, is the transformation of Guantanamo Bay from a detention camp to an interrogation camp. And events very quickly follow on from that initial, from that point when Dunlavey is appointed. In March 2002, Leonard learns that he's to be replaced as the commanding officer for JTF 160 with, I'm sure he won't mind me saying it, General Rick Bacchus, who is a much more compliant kind of person, and Dunlavey, who's a two-star general, who's managing this much smaller unit. JTF 170 effectively can boss this guy about and run the show, and he effectively becomes the controlling force at Guantanamo. He, of course, is a man that all the time brags about the fact he's working directly for the president. He's working for Rumsfeld. He doesn't need to go through any kind of military rigmarole. He's the direct guy, and he's the big boots, as it were. And the final point, I think, which is, it is mentioned in the book, obviously, and it's very important, but I mean, the final transformation point comes in August 2002, where a further legal memo is issued by the Office of the Legal Counsel, which effectively legalizes what we would, in common parlance, call torture at Guantanamo. So you very rapidly get this transition from a holding facility to an interrogation facility. And it's that process which the book covers in a very, very short period of time and provides fantastic detail. Great credit to Karen for highlighting this and bring it to all of our attention. So without further ado, I hope you understand. I hope that's not too schematic, but that's the general terrain that we're talking about here. And I don't want to say too much more. I'm going to prompt Peter from time to time if he's not interrogating Karen sufficiently, and maybe even directly ask Karen the odd question myself. But I'd like now to pass over to Peter, who obviously is in a great position to talk about some of these issues with Karen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. It won't be an interrogation. As you know, in this country, we don't interrogate people. We interview them in accordance with the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So it'll all be very gentle and so on and so forth. Can I just say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be back here at the Frontline Club, actually, because this is a place where I have spent many happy hours over the past few years with colleagues from the media, giving them all those in-depth background briefings that never occurred. As a means of trying to counteract, and I can say this now, the quite ridiculous sub judice rules we have in this country, which prevent the public knowing what everybody else in the world knows in this age of global communication, because we don't trust our juries to be able to sort out the prejudicial from the probative. And so it was hugely important for years to be able to speak with colleagues here and other places about what was actually happening in this country. So it's a great pleasure to be back here. Having said that, Nick, I think, has done a masterful job in just summing up the incredibly complicated story of the birth of Guantanamo. And there are all sorts of things that struck me when I read Karen's book. And then the first thing, I suppose, was this military order. If there's a starting point anyway, it's this military order that came from the President himself in November 2001. Now, we can all recall the atmosphere at the time and so on and so forth, but I find it, as an observer, quite extraordinary that, albeit a head of state and commander-in-chief, can give an order of that kind with the implications which it had. And here in this country, we tend to say that a written constitution might sometimes actually enshrine the checks and balances, which we sometimes feel are a little bit informal here. But there, with a written constitution, it struck me that the President had quite extraordinary powers. And I just wonder if you have a comment, Karen, on whether those powers actually should be as they are when they're used in that way.
Well, thank you for that difficult question, which I'll get back to. But I want to thank Nick for having us and for saying that very generous thing, because I have to tell you that I had so little clue of how to go about this. So basically, I have a lot of friends that are journalists, and I would call them up and I'd say, what do you do when? And everybody would tell me. Nobody got territorial. Nobody said, well, I'm not, I never felt that kind of really sort of withholding feeling. Everybody was really generous. Like, I was this I'm very educable. And so I had all these great tutors, and they sort of taught me. So anyway, that's what happened. The presidential powers issue. I think now the United States is in the middle of a debate over whether or not the Presidential Powers Clause is insufficient. And the reason is that what we learned, to put it very simply, is that it matters who the president is. And so we've always sort of trusted that the president would behave, and so there were checks and balances, but there wasn't any way of saying you can't usurp power like power was usurped for him and the Secretary of Defense. And the way in which they restructured everything so that the Department of Justice and the Department of State were out of the loop, not to mention the National Security Advisor, was based on the Presidential Powers Clause. About 3 years ago, when we were still in the middle of this, I had dinner with a very renowned professor at Yale, a law professor, who writes about these issues. And I said, just off the cuff, we've had a few glasses of wine. Like, what do you think? Do you think we need to redraft this clause in the Constitution? And I was shocked, because I thought I was asking such a provocative question. He didn't think about it. He said, absolutely. And he's not one prone to rethinking these things. And so I think that what happened was a sort of milestone was passed about the sacredness of the Constitution itself, because that's a major thing to say we're going to rethink how we've thought about presidential powers. I think Obama is very much aware of the fact that this issue is one a lot of people would prefer went away. And in the first three orders that he let out when he became president, actually they address this issue. It doesn't look like it, because they're about interrogation, about detention, and about closing Guantanamo. But if you read them in the context of this military order, you'll see that they are that they basically say, guess what? The president doesn't have unchecked powers, and certainly the Pentagon does not have unchecked powers, which was the tag-on to presidential powers. And in fact, when we think about these things going forward, it's going to be the Department of Justice. And so they are running all of these shows now in the case of detention in tandem with the Department of Defense. And it affects presidential powers because now there's a reintroduction of the conversation, the interagency process, the way it should have been. So that's an insufficient answer, but that's as best I can tell.
But at the time, one of the checks and balances was Congress.
Yeah. Well,
But Congress seems to have been incredibly passive about this. Why was that?
I can tell you in 2 words. Well, 2 kind of words. 3,000 people died.
Right.
And that's what they said time and time again when they've been asked. They'd say, then and later, 3,000 people died. What did you expect? And whether we like that answer or not, I think there was a way. And Guantanamo opened 4 months to the day of 9/11. It is very rapid in terms of the emotional destabilization that took place within the country. And the pressure is put on Congress to make sure that the country stayed safe. And I'll tell you something else. I think they were thrilled to defer. You want to handle this? You handle it. And sort of, remember what George Bush did? He said 2 things that were completely contradictory, and everybody let him get away with it. He said, we are going to restructure, rethink, and extra legalize our process about national security when it comes to terror. And this military order is an example. And at the same time, he said, this is going to be life as usual. Go to the shopping malls. Remember that? You do. Nothing's going to change. And basically, the American people, which I would put in the same basket with Congress, said, fantastic. Nothing's going to change. You're going to handle all the dirty stuff for us. We're done. Goodbye. And it worked. So, sorry.
Well, if we get through the procedural bit, I'm interested then about why it was this thing was set up and what was it envisaged it was going to be. Nick's talked about the transformation from a detention facility to an interrogation centre or intelligence gathering or whatever. I remember when I came into my job in heading up the anti-terrorist branch in May 2002, speaking to my predecessor, who was, I think it's fair to say, a bit miffed about the fact that the evidential people, if you like, the people who conduct evidential investigations in the UK, the anti-terrorist branch, have been denied the opportunity to go to Guantanamo to interview the British suspects who were there, and that had been done by others. Which to me says that from a very early stage, a decision had been taken somewhere that this was not about investigating culpability of individuals with a view to putting them before some sort of tribunal, whatever sort of tribunal anywhere, but something else. And in the book, you mentioned that General Myers was talking about general intelligence gathering rather than investigating what individuals had done. And it seems to me that there must have been a decision very early on that this was not about finding out what these individuals had done, but some sort of broader intelligence gathering purpose, and that it was never intended that this place would be purely a detention centre. I don't know, what do you think about that, Karen? Okay,
so this is when I turn to my journalist friends and I say, so if you know something, how do you tell them you know it without telling you how you know it? Okay, so there's this one story that one of the members of the JTF tells that I really love, which is that they have 96 hours to build Guantanamo for the first detainees. And they rush around and they do all these, sort of ad hoc things, and they, there's this super team and they build it. But they think they're building it for detention and for war crimes trials. And so they're looking for a courthouse because they figure there should be they have some ideas. So they're waiting for the order for the courthouse. So it becomes like a joke. Seriously, among them, like, so have they told you yet where to put the courthouse? Like week 1, week 2. And so by the end of this 100 days, they realized there wasn't going to be a courthouse, which was not pleasing to them, because then what were they doing? But the more the official story would be this. When Nick said that they called the International Committee of the Red Cross in defiance of Rumsfeld and the Joint Chiefs. They called them, they said, you want to come. The minute they'd done that, they changed the calculation on Guantanamo. And Rumsfeld was furious that this had happened because he'd said no, he'd been very clear about it. But it was one of 2 acts of defiance. And it was when he found out about the second one that he decided to do how to restructure Guantanamo. And the second act of defiance was this. there are two stages of orders in the U.S. military. One is a be prepared order, and one is an execute order. Now, Donald Rumsfeld had worked in the Pentagon before. He should have known this, and they knew he should have known it. On the detention order, the execute order was signed. But on the interrogation order, nobody actually gave it to Rumsfeld to sign. So after about 2 weeks of his not getting information, which he was on the line to get, having moved these people halfway around the world and spent a lot of money and taken people that were supposed to go to Kuwait and Iraq and put them there. I mean, he had really moved mountains to make Guantanamo happen. Didn't get his, he wasn't getting his interrogation. He called up in this very public, I mean within this realm, public video telephone conference, which means a lot of people saw it. He said, where's my information? And they said, what information? He said, well, how's my interrogation effort going? And they said, well, you never signed the execute order, which was pretty radical thing to say to the Secretary of Defense. And they were basically sending him a message, which is, we're not signing this order because we're not going to do this. You've already told us the Geneva Conventions don't apply. You've already told us not to have the ICRC. We're not human rights advocates down here, but we also don't want to violate our profession, our military code, and we think actually we could go to jail for this. I mean, they understood the law-free zone they'd been put in as the pawns for somebody else. So from the beginning, Rumsfeld wanted it to be an interrogation unit, but he couldn't set it up that way. There was no precedent for it. There's no way to do it, and in this period of time, he figures out a way to do it.
Whoever came up with the idea that these people actually had valuable intelligence, because it's quite clear. A lot of them weren't identified.
Yeah,
a lot of them came in there through a variety of routes, some perhaps off the battlefield, some we know came from elsewhere. One of the British guys, as I understand it, was almost a passerby. He's on the wrong bus at the wrong time.
Yeah.
One of the British guys. And there seemed to be a presupposition that there would be valuable intelligence. And this is before the concept of high-value detainees and all the rest of it came into being. There's clearly an idea that somehow the key to all sorts of things sat there in Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah, this is actually worth a whole book. And I try to weave some of it in. But this is a complicated story. Donald Rumsfeld believed that these people had valuable information. He was wrong. And the question is, why did he get it wrong? One of the reasons was the rampant ignorance inside the U.S. government and the intelligence agencies about Afghanistan at the time and what was actually happening on the ground. Another reason was the failure at Tora Bora, which sort of went right through the ranks, the military ranks, and the top levels of the government. What do you mean you let bin Laden, who supposedly was there, and others get away? So part of it was after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda got away, after the Tora Bora incident, there was a feeling that they had to have detainees, and they had to have detainees that they could interrogate. There was also a belief that no matter who the detainee was, they'd have information, if not of telling them what was going on the battlefield, they would have some kind of information. And that information could be like, how many times a day do Muslims pray? I'm not kidding you. They needed cultural information, which is why the ICRC turned out to be so important, so they could say that. And this way of using Guantanamo for low-level information has persisted to this day. When I was there 2 years ago, and I talked to the head of the camp at the time, who was, let me say, extremely unpleasant, but whatever. I just like to say that because he was so mean. I feel like I have to say something. He said, I said, come on, you've had these guys here for 7 years. Do you honestly believe, or 6 years, do you honestly believe that they have information? And he said, in as dismissive a way as possible, look, Al-Qaeda is changing every day. So you like this, as somebody who actually knows something. Al-Qaeda is changing every day. There's new leadership. There are new changes in the network. It's always possible that the new people, our people here will know. And they can draw us a picture of them, and then we can go and get them. That's what he said to me. And I was like, and he wasn't thinking, I'll pull the wool. He honestly thought this. And so one of my friends called it Gitmopedia. They just kept, but there was a level of just thinking they didn't know what they could get out of them. Didn't have to be that trivial. They didn't know what they could get out of them, but they knew there could be something. And they weren't quite sure. they move the high-value detainees there late in the process because they know that they didn't have. Now, these guys on the ground figure out really early on that these are mostly kind of loser guys that are wannabes more than dangerous terrorists. And while there are some dangerous terrorists mixed in, they went out of their way to make sure that those guys didn't get to Guantanamo. Because at that time, the CIA had its own places.
Well, that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, and so they knew from the get-go, like, where are the interesting guys going? And Michael Dunlavey figured it out. And I don't know if I write about this, but he figured it out. He's like, what? So he took himself to CENTCOM. Like, why are you sending me these guys? Donald Rumsfeld put me in head of this interrogation, or I'm supposed to be getting information. You're sending me these idiots. Send me terrorists, you know? So, so there's, I don't know why they miscalculated, but I think ignorance and arrogance and some combination of the two.
Interesting. I mean, I'm used to working with old intelligence, but that takes the biscuit, that one. But I mean, there's a fascinating point you make that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, all these people, they didn't pitch up there for years, did they? Long time. But if the purpose was, from early days, that this was going to be an interrogation centre, an intelligence gathering exercise, why then did it go to the military, not to another part of the US administration who deal with intelligence?
Short answer, because Donald Rumsfeld could control the military, he thought, in a way that he could not control the CIA and other agencies. And a lot of intelligence agencies are inside, the military. So he preferred, Dunlavey was from the NSA, he preferred to use that. Now, one issue we don't know the answer to, and no journalist, hint, hint, has ever written about it, and should.
Well, someone will after this.
Is, and I certainly have no clue how to do it, is the relationship between the Pentagon and the CIA. And what's so interesting with all these new memos coming out is that nobody's asking. When we figure out that piece, which we still don't know, we do know that there was a lot of tension between Rumsfeld and the agency early on. We know that somehow these various interrogation efforts were coordinated, but actually that's a part of the story nobody's even asked. So until they ask, we're certainly not going to know.
Just moving on to Dunlavey Arrival. Now, I enjoyed the book because, unlike many of these books, it actually read a little bit like a novel. It was a bit of a page-turner. And although you didn't go in for your character judgments, you could actually discern what you were thinking about some of these people. And to put it one way, Dunlavey came over loud and clear to me as the bogeyman in the book. Yeah. Two questions about bogeyman. After he arrived, what was the line of command, first of all, in reality? And secondly, was his arrival by accident or by design? Was he put there? He was plucked from being a reservist.
Right.
How did he get to Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah. Actually, this is a fun part of the story to unearth, because he is a family court judge in Erie, Pennsylvania. He has ties to Tom Ridge. He has ties to the NSA, and he's well liked at the NSA. This is one place where I kind of did a lot of things that never got into the book. He is well respected prior to this event. And he's one of these guys who loves to spend his weekends, at NSA headquarters,
He's a party guy, I think you say, at some point.
He's totally a party guy.
Well, that came out as well,
but he, not as much as it should have. He was way more, anyway. So, and he had a history of interrogations, as he always liked to boast. I did 3,000, interrogations in Vietnam. And he got in very well with people at the head of NSA during his time there. And so when they picked him, they knew who he was. And there was no question that he would be loyal to the people who asked him to serve him, and not necessarily the military. The chain of command thing you're asking is actually the thing I find most interesting about how this was treated in the American Congress. Because we had all these hearings, as you know, we've had 110 hearings, I think, on detention, interrogation issues. And when they've had Haynes there, who is the lawyer, and others, they've been smart, they being Congress, has been smart enough to say, who did you report to? No, did you report of the chain of command? And the answer is always yes. But they didn't ask the follow-up question, which is the only thing that mattered, which was, what was your chain of command? The chain of command for people like Mike Dunlavey in that position was up through Southcom to the Joint Chiefs and the Pentagon. But Michael Dunlavey's chain of command, which he offered in pride to everybody continually, and then when he was formally interrogated by Schmidt for the Schmidt report on Guantanamo, his answer was, his answer actually was, I worked directly for the president. But his other answer was, I worked directly for Don Rumsfeld. And actually that was the case. He worked for Don Rumsfeld. Now, that doesn't make Southcom, get them off the hook, because they knew what was happening, and they just thought, we're out of it. We don't have any control, and they shouldn't have. The chain of command is culpable, and I think they know it. I mean, I definitely think they know it. And they were presented with a lot of choices where they could have pushed back, they could have said things, and they didn't. So, but there were two chains of command. And as you know, if you study anything about the military or just watch a lot of movies, you'll know that unity of command and effort is the prime directive in the military, and you do not break it. And so Rumsfeld knew exactly what he was doing when he put in two parallel commands in the same place fighting over the same mission. And when Backus came in, as you mentioned, Dunlavey starts having meetings without Backus of Backus's team. And he just doesn't invite him. And Backus doesn't go, like if that were you, wouldn't you go in and say, hey, I'm coming to this meeting? No, he would just hide in his office, writing memos, like don't chew gum. And it was.
I've known people like that. Yeah.
Exactly, but it was sad, kind of, and whatever. So the chain of command was broken as the ultimate.
I think this unity of effort thing is interesting. I'll come back to that if I may, when we talk about some of the negotiations between the US and the UK government for the return of detainees. But before we get there, culture is something that I find very interesting. The culture, the prevailing culture of the regime at Guantanamo. Now, from where I sat here in the UK, 2002, 2003, the early part of 2004, we knew Guantanamo was there, but I had no perception at all as to what the prevailing culture was. And the first window of sort of vision I had of this actually came in Washington in January, February 2004, when you remember that there were 9 British citizens who had been detained in Guantanamo Bay. Tony Blair and President Bush had agreed a policy objective, which was that the United Kingdom should ask for their return here. And as Nick said in opening, I was part of the cross-government group that went out there to begin these negotiations. And we got to the stage where the agreement was reached that the first 4 of them would come back. This was early in 2004, February, March. And we got to the stage in the discussions where we're getting to the logistics of it all. And apparently the only aircraft that could go to Guantanamo was a Royal Air Force C-17, and at that time the United States would only allow military aircraft in. So this thing had to fly, and of course the people who were going to come back had to be escorted. And the decision was made that there would be police officers to act as the escort. No powers of arrest, of course, in Cuba. So they couldn't possibly be brought into UK custody at that point, but only into the care of the Metropolitan Police. And there were all sorts of discussions about how this was going to work, so on and so forth. And I remember at one particular point, I found myself in a corner of the Pentagon in discussion with quite a senior Marine officer, and saying to him, okay, this plane is going to land full of Royal Air Force personnel and Metropolitan Police officers, who incidentally were not special Metropolitan Police officers, counter-terrorist officers. They were actually drawn off the streets of Charing Cross. The group of them were told, what duty do you think you're on next Sunday? We're walking number 4 beat. So, no, actually, you're going to Cuba. All right? Oh, all right, come on. And so about 20 odd of these, about 20 or so of these guys were told to sort of get their passports together and get ready to go to Cuba, which they did. And I was in the Pentagon talking to this, say, quite senior Marine officer. And I said to him, look, this is going to happen, that the aircraft's going to land, and at the appointed time, the Metropolitan Police will be lining the ramp to receive the detainees into the care of the Metropolitan Police. And I said to this guy, at the point that the detainees are brought to the aircraft, will they be shackled? And forgive the accent, his reply to me was, yes, sir. They'll be doing a Gitmo shuffle. And I thought, what does this tell me about culture, about the attitude towards the treatment of these people, And I said to him, well, they will not step foot on the Royal Air Force aircraft while shackled. Simple as that. That will not happen. It's going to happen, sir. No, it ain't. They're coming into our care. They will be unshackled. What actually happened on the day, they turned up there, and my officers were there to receive them. And would you believe they come across the bay, they turned up shackled, and they left the key behind. So they had to go all the way back. But they did not step onto that Royal Air Force aircraft shackled. It was a die in the ditch point for as far as I was concerned. Now, that was early 2004. Do you think that culture was set early?
I think, remember, the military is the hero of this book. The point of the book is that left up to its own efforts, the military would have done this legally and honorably because that's who they were. That's the point of the book. And that as soon as that became evident, they were yanked out of there. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a tremendous effort on the part of the commanding general, Mike Leonard, and his team. And this maybe as a part of the book I could have done more on and didn't, to tether some sort of nasty passions. And the debate, this is going to sound very trite, but it's actually not. The debate, or even if it is, it's important. The debate, subtext at Guantanamo the whole time over detention, interrogation, treatment, everything, Rumsfeld, Leonard, was, will we treat them humanely or will we not treat them humanely? The idea was not we want to treat them inhumanely because we're mean people. It was a theory of detention which said, if you treat them humanely, they will begin to ask for things, they will go on hunger strikes, whatever. But it was even more than that. It was the idea that if you treat them by the Geneva Conventions, now of course this is how then they won't talk to us in the interrogation room because they need to be destabilized, they need to be disoriented. And so Mike Leonard's in there trying to institute some kind of stability. They're trying, the Pentagon and a number of people that he'd sent down, to destabilize the regime. And all of this takes place in the context of the do's and don'ts of humane treatment. Michael Leonard's idea is, we're going to talk to these guys. That is like the rule number one. You do not talk to these guys outside of the interrogation room. So the minute he does that, it begins to crack the veneer. But there were people, the reason, we haven't talked about the Muslim chaplain. The reason they would visit, the general and his chaplain, this general would go to the camp at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, he never said to me, I went there because I didn't trust the troops to behave in the middle of the night with these detainees who they were extremely angry about and who they sometimes said vengeful things about. But he did it. And there's no doubt in my mind that was one of the reasons. So they had them mostly under control, but it was a problem the whole time. So once the interrogation interrogation becomes the dominant thing with the camp, then anything, the Gitmo Shuffle, it's nothing compared to what you can get away with if nobody's looking.
Yeah, what surprised me was that in this sterile atmosphere of the Pentagon, on a formal intergovernmental discussion, that's what was put in front of me.
That they would talk about it like that, because that has to do with dehumanizing people, and that was a very strong part of it. The Gitmo Shuffle, it just sort of takes them out of how you would, what surprises you, it's so politically incorrect to talk about human beings like that.
And to me, it suggests if somebody's prepared to use that sort of expression, that there's a huge amount of top cover somewhere.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Can I just ask a supplementary, because one of the points that comes across there is when Dunlavey is brought in, the way he subverts many of the procedures. I mean, for example, the changing importance and use of psychiatrists. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that happens when Dunlavey comes in is he has been told basically this will be an interrogation camp. So he therefore tells people that therefore whatever you have is mine. Whatever information you have. So where do they have information? They have information, there's an intelligence unit of the 160. They have information in the medical facility. And they have information just generally that's probably mixed into the intelligence stuff. Now, the intelligence information, was very little in 2002. These guys arrived with, so the plane would arrive with the detainees, 20, sometimes 30, and then a bag of materials would arrive, pocket litter, except it wasn't separated by detainee. And they had no idea who it belonged to. And the intelligence officer, who was actually a pretty intelligent guy, actually an interesting guy, who look at this stuff, he'd say, oh my God. So they start to try to make up files, but the files are not from the material that came with the detainees. The files become what we observe in the detainees day to day. And so that all their intelligence for these early guys, for the most part, came from just reading who they were, who talked to whom, what was the so they guessed about the chain of command. They made up things. They were convinced that there was a whole series of signals going on. I mean, it was pretty intense reading of every single movement the detainees made. And then, of course, there's the medical information. And so Dunlavey goes and asks for the psychiatric files because they want to use it in interrogation. Well, the guy's afraid of bugs, as we saw with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or whatever, or Abu Ghraib. He's afraid of bugs. Well, we'll use the bugs. Let's see what he's afraid of. And the doctor who was there with the original unit said, he's not a doctor, the head medical officer said, that's not happening. You want psychiatrists, you get your own psychiatrists. Our psychiatrists are for us to do on this. We're not authorized to work that way. Now, I didn't research or write about the later part, but Mike Leonard protected those files, and he was there to protect it. Once you take him out, and this medical officer talked to me about, they discover one day that their files are all rifled through, and they know exactly. And so it was a story. This story was going to happen. They were going to stop it as long as they could, but it was going to happen.
Well, something I found interesting throughout this process was that somehow the sense that, or the thought that these were the really bad guys at the very beginning, irrespective of how they come into custody in the first place and all the rest of it, translated through then into the negotiations about return. And the main thrust of all these discussions was what measures were the UK going to take in order to ensure that these people, having been released, no longer provided a threat to the United States. And my role, I suppose, was to describe the procedures in the UK, the law, what would happen to them on return. And I remember several times trying to explain that actually in this country you can arrest somebody, which would take place with some of them and not with others, and then they'd go to the police station, and then within 48 hours they'd have to be in court for a warrant of further detention or not, depending upon what the available evidence was. And I remember this description being met, A, with incredulity, and B, with a certain amount of disdain, and side issues, words such as being soft on terrorism, I remember being used, which I found quite ironic, since at that time in this country I was being regularly beaten up for doing the opposite, as it were. But nevertheless, what I found was that there was complete lack of understanding, bearing in mind that the delegations were heavily lawyered, and there were lots of lawyers there, between a lack of understanding of the distinction between intelligence and evidence. And I remember saying about one particular individual, he would not be arrested on return to the United Kingdom, be subject to immigration procedures and then released because there were no grounds and proper grounds for his arrest. And this was met with complete incredulity, but he's the worst of the worst. So, well, give me the evidence then. Tell me, show me how this is, how do you know this?
Let me tell you how this trickled down. I would say we know kind of the top structure, and the answer to how do we know this is, we think this. But what I would say to people at the Pentagon who visited Guantanamo with the VIPs, so that's two categories, and then to the people actually on the ground who'd say, we had some really bad guys here. I would say, how did you know they were bad guys? And they would say to me, they said they were going to kill me and my children. That's why they were bad guys, because they said they were going to kill them when they got out. And the detainees succeeded in terrorizing, literally terrorizing a lot of these troops from day one. They're told they're the worst of the worst. Then these guys say, we get out, we're going to find you. When I interviewed Rick Backus, I went to Rhode Island to interview him. This was a man who was pulled out. They get something on him. Long story short, they get something on him. And they basically say, you're out of here. And he can't talk because they have, however they let him go, it's some issue. So he goes home, and this is years later when I interview him, and he's working at inside what feels like a maximum security facility being the accountant, and he's telling me how terrified he is of his enemies, Al-Qaeda, that want to get him. I mean, it penetrated, so I don't want to just make fun of what they thought, but when you say, how did you know they were bad guys, I felt like saying, were you never in 5th grade? Did never anybody threaten to beat you up? But we so over-empowered the Al-Qaeda because what had happened on 9/11. The idea that they could perform feats that they would come to the United States and come to some small town and hunt these people down was very real for them. So what does that tell you about a general atmosphere and a general attitude?
Yeah. I mean,
I didn't make it right.
I accept it's not easy because I mean, there are some genuinely bad guys who have been taken there.
Yeah, some of them are at Guantanamo.
Some of them are.
Yeah.
And also there's the issue, of course, that in a battlefield or wherever, forensic collection of evidence, interviewing people under certain procedures is not #1 priority, far from it. But I think the lack of then trying to impose some sort of structure on that is what gave rise to difficulties. And I remember saying to these people, in the administration, actually there is not a single shred of admissible evidence against any of these people. Being met with shock, horror, gasp.
And probably 3,000 people died.
Yeah, well, a bit of that. Yes.
And that's how we get to torture.
But,
that's the whole.
But I think this unity of effort question that you mentioned earlier is fascinating, because another thing I remember very well from those discussions was that the United States delegation was led by John Bellinger, usually, when he was legal counsel to State Department at that stage.
First National Security Advisor, and then
yeah, the state.
Much later.
And of course, there's Department of Justice, Department of Defense, CIA, Southcom, a large delegation. The British delegation was small but perfectly formed, as you would expect, keeping down the costs on transatlantic flights and all the rest of it, and would be typically perhaps half a dozen strong, something like that. I remember one meeting in the old executive office building at the White House, and it started off with about 20, 25 people on the United States side, and I say us, a small British delegation. And the meeting went on for some hours, and as it went on, so it became apparent that some actions which had been agreed at previous meetings hadn't been carried out by various parts, whether it was DOD or DOJ or whoever hadn't done it. And then as the meeting went on, people began to filter out from the United States delegation, and it ended up with John Bellinger as the delegation leader by himself in splendid isolation. And I remember him looking across at us and just, see what I'm trying to deal with, guys? Now, to me, that was a huge insight into the difficulties that he was personally facing in trying to bring this unity of effort, which didn't seem to be there across the entire administration, to resolving some of these issues. Do you think that actually had an impact on the way the camp was run and policies there?
Certainly during my period, it had an impact, and later because of what that meant in terms of the policies, the legal policies that were generated. On the ground at the camp, they keep saying, there's some fight in Washington, we don't know what it is, but there's something going on in Washington, and we're still not getting any guidance down here, and there's some issue. Like, I think they probably knew what, but they didn't exactly know what it was. I think that John Bellinger is actually a very interesting case, because John Bellinger was kept. This is the story he tells, and for the period of time I work on, it bears out. He was kept out of the loop intentionally. Now, how on earth do you keep the lawyer for the National Security Advisor out of the loop when you're having a discussion, of this nature? So he was allowed to go to meetings with you because people would have said, okay, but he didn't have any power. He couldn't. My guess is he couldn't have taken what happened at a meeting with you and translated it anywhere. So do I think that had an impact? Huge. Because the real impact is that there are two things going on, what you see and what you don't see. And John Bellinger was part of the what you see. And then what we didn't see are the things that we've now learned, these memos that became the August 1st memos. And I think that had a huge impact in what became the Guantanamo we know.
Peter, can I...
Looking at his watch?
No. I want to make sure they've got enough time to question you.
Indeed.
Because I think people here would be also interested in your visits to the States. And one thing I want to ask you is, where was the impetus coming from to bring those UK citizens back to the UK? Was this because the Americans were saying, find some way of getting them back, or was this because the government here wanted those people back? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think that's a very good question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to it. It came out as a policy objective of the UK government. Now, what sat behind it, whether it was political, in a simple political sense that the government felt that it was something it ought to be doing at the time, or whether it was because there was a prospect of legal challenge to inaction, and I think that certainly gave some impetus to some of the later discussions. Clive Stafford Smith and others, I think, were quite clear that the British government had a legal duty to negotiate for the return of these people, British citizens who were being held in a legal limbo elsewhere, as it was described. So it's probably a mixture of the two. But my simple answer is I don't know precisely what it was that gave rise to that policy objective.
Stafford Smith's argument had not been legally tested. There had not been a challenge, had there, at that time?
Not at that stage, no.
No.
No. But I think as time went on, particularly when it came to the desire to return to the UK those people who are claiming UK residence rights as opposed to UK citizenship, I think there was an issue there that potentially legal challenge could have forced the government's hand.
Why did that, I mean, are you in a position to answer this? Why did that second part, in a sense, to get back the residents, why did that take so long compared to the citizens?
That's a very good question. I think it's a simple matter of priorities. You start with citizens. I think the government's initial position was that there was no obligation to negotiate for the return of people who are claiming residence rights, some of whom, remember, were here, as it were, under false pretenses anyway.
Were you ever told, we're not bothered about those people?
No, absolutely not, no, not at all. No, I have to say that once the policy objective was set, whether internally one felt this is something we should be spending an awful lot of time on or not, that's irrelevant. Policy objective was set, and from what I saw from those cross-governmental groups was an absolute professional determination to achieve the policy objective. Simple as that.
Okay, sorry, please continue.
Well, I was bearing in mind the time for Q&As, but also looking forward, what's Obama going to do about all this? He's made the pledge.
Yeah, duck and cover, I don't know. He's going to, okay. The one thing that he started to do that's kind of the obvious is that about half of these people, of 800 detainees at Guantanamo, 600 have been just under 600 have been returned home or to third countries diplomatically. Only 2 people have gotten out of Guantanamo because of the military commissions. What does that tell you? That tells you that the coverage of Guantanamo has been pathetic because we think it's all about legal trials. It's not. The legal trials are going to be important, but this is about diplomacy. And Pierre Prosper and John Bellinger afterwards took up, this was their charge. It was aggressive diplomacy in these first years, and you know what it took to place all these people in all these countries? So now, relative to that, we're left with a very small group. Let's say 3 dozen is the sort of general approximation, will be tried, and they think they can be convicted one way or another, maybe for pre-9/11 crimes with evidence from pre-9/11 crimes, who knows. Another group will go home this way, or they will be sent to a third party if there are fears of torture or whatever. That is a huge number. It approximates half of who's there. And so what it tells you about the Obama administration now, and they know that. They're letting out one person, some to here, I hear. I hear, they have deals with a number of countries that they're making, and they're doing this as a way of understanding how to close it. The question before Obama, and I know I don't need to tell anybody in this room, the only question on closing Guantanamo, there are 2, but there's one, is he going to allow for a third category of people who are not convictable, not triable, and therefore won't be charged, but will be detained indefinitely. And this is the only question. The rest is actually relatively simple. There are difficulties, and within this larger question is the question that's now all over the papers today and yesterday, which is, are Americans going to allow detainees onto their soil? Yeah. Which is really amazing because, when Guantanamo Bay detention facility was opened, one of the things the book talks about is there is a community of 1,700 people. There is an American community there of, wives and husbands and children and schools and all of those things. And when they hear...
You talk about town meetings, don't you?
There's all these town meetings. When they hear that these guys are coming, they wear their T-shirts to the town meetings, you know. And they have the head of the naval base and Mike Leonard talk to them. And you would think that what I said is, how are you going to keep us safe? But that comes up, but it is not what's on their minds. What these, mostly wives, want to know is, are you going to try to take us away from our husbands the way that happened in '92 when we had Cuban migrants and Haitian migrants detained here because they sent the families home. Now remember, this conversation is taking place at Christmas time, the last time you want to raise the idea of separating families, and they're terrified of it, and they're not thinking, well, you know, we're going to have they know that they are sure Osama bin Laden's coming. They are not thinking that this is going to be anything but the worst terrorist you can imagine. But that's not what their concern is. Why? Because it was their families and the military to which they are, rose-colored glasses about. They were positive that their spouses would keep them safe. They weren't worried about it. And it comes up, and they decide to stay as a group. And Mike Leonard says, I'll protect you as much as you can to stay here. But you think about that compared with, now we're going to move them to Leavenworth, or we're going to move them here, and all of these towns in the United States they're coming up with these long letters written by congressmen, sometime by others, saying, you better not bring these people here because, and like, this is, I obviously understand that they think they're a security concern, but they're not most likely a concerted concern. There is yet to be a terrorist trial in the United States of a serious or maybe you know of one, of a serious high-level terrorist, well, except the ones you guys keep here that we don't have. We don't have,
yeah, well, we save you the trouble, lock them up.
That we haven't convicted and put away forever.
Yeah.
They're in Colorado.
But there was an extraordinary mythology, wasn't there, about these people, the types of people that are going to turn up at Guantanamo.
Yeah.
The blindfolding, the shackling, all the rest of it on the initial flight there.
Yeah.
As I recall, because somebody somewhere said, well, they're going to eat their way through the control cables of the plane. That sort of
That
thing.
was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Myers. That's
right.
Pretty intense, yeah.
Yeah. Which
well, actually,
extraordinary.
that was extraordinary because the first day of Guantanamo is interesting. When these guys get off the plane, so everybody's poised. They've been practicing, for however many days. They don't have that much time, but they're practicing, and they've drilled this to the nth degree. And they have the amount of helicopters and Humvees and machine guns they have for these guys, and they're waiting, and the plane opens, right? And these guys walk out, and they're like, they weigh less than me. Okay, they're little guys, and they're somewhat crippled. Some of them wounded.
One was 90 years old.
One was 90 years old. Another one was 80 in his 80s. And one was clinically insane, and they knew it, and they just put him on the plane, and and they realized this within 5 hours as they start to process these guys that they just don't seem to be what they were promised, and it's such a disorienting fact, and they never quite recover from it. This first group, which is why they had to go, they never could quite figure out why they weren't getting the bad guys that they wanted the bad guys.
One of the bits that jumped out the page of the book at me was your description of that first arrival and the fact that they're all put on a yellow school bus. Yeah. And I think you described it as something, a devaluing of an American icon.
It's so weird. They take this school bus, right? They rip the chairs out and they put the detainees in this school bus, and they don't have time to paint it. They knew they're not going to use it. It was such a... And the families are all lining the roads like a parade to see this, with their kids. And
a few Geneva Convention issues there.
Yeah, but they're on the floor, so you can only see the soldiers. You can't see the faces of these guys. And they bring them through the base, and all these and everybody got that there was something very wrong with this yellow school bus sort of parading these detainees. It was just such a clash of images that it couldn't quite register. Yeah, I like that scene. I wanted to write just about the first day.
Be a good film.
Yeah, that'd be a good film.
I think we possibly could take some questions now. Would that be? Are there any more questions that you want to ask directly now? Or?
No. I think all sorts of things will come up in the discussion.
Okay.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Can I open the discussion now? Then, plenty of people here. Gentleman at the front.
Hi, Peter. Just wanted to know, obviously you made it pretty clear that you don't think obviously no evidence was brought that could bring anyone to justice from Guantanamo, but do you feel that any intelligence came from Guantanamo that you've use to crack cases over here?
It's an interesting question that I've often been asked, and the truthful answer is I don't know. I do know that a lot of intelligence that has been hugely useful, and I say intelligence, not evidence, intelligence, which has given us a start point on a lot of investigations here, has come from detainee reporting. I don't know where, I don't know when, I don't know how. Whether any of that came from Guantanamo, I simply don't know. The police obviously deal with the intelligence through other agencies. It comes to us, we deal with it.
Would you be in difficulties admitting that you had acted on intelligence that came from Guantanamo?
No, not in the slightest.
Okay.
It's absolutely clear, just to get it absolutely right, the House of Lords has made it absolutely clear, restated what we all know to be the law here, that nothing that has been improperly obtained can be used in evidence in any court in the UK, and that's absolutely right and as it should be. The question, of course, is if a piece of intelligence comes in and you can't actually fathom out how or where it was obtained, should you therefore not act upon it or investigate to see whether it's true or not, in order to try to do something in terms of public
presumably
safety?
You wouldn't know whether it was gained through harsh interrogation methods or from our methods? Yeah.
Not a clue, no.
Thank you. Gentleman behind you.
Thank you. My name's Peter Clarke. I'm a photographer. I've been working with quite a few of the British detainees who were released, and I've just come back from Guantanamo. I spent 8 days there with Carol Rosenberg from Miami Herald. I've got two questions, really. First is a general question. Even once Guantanamo has been shut down and the CIA prisons, other prisons in theory, have been closed as well, has the whole experience set a precedent for extraordinary rendition to be a current and active policy for governments like America and the British government? And secondly, for Guantanamo itself, Camp 7 in Guantanamo, you talk about the types of detainees that are still there and what will happen to them. When I was there, no one's allowed into Camp 7, no one's seen Camp 7. Are there people there who are the high-level detainees? Or, as I got the impression, kind of talking to the American guards and talking to the people who run the place, is that the fear of what's going to happen once all the torture allegations come out is that there may be detainees there who have been through torture, who have the worst stories to tell, and perhaps those are some of the people who may not be released at all.
Yeah, so those are the hugely disturbing questions. And they, and there is a worry that much of what's been done is to not know. For example, originally in the Jepsen case with the Obama administration saying, which is the rendition flights case, that also involved Binyam Mohammed. The court said, allowed the Obama's lawyers said, we stand with our Bush predecessors, who happen to be some of the same lawyers. And we are, state secrets covers this, and we're not going to allow this. However, that's been overturned. So we don't know. Maybe we're moving in a different direction. But the worry there was that it wasn't state secrets. It was guilt, and that they didn't want to let the evidence that would show who was there and then who might have to be prosecuted, because when you have certain kinds of evidence of torture, what else are you going to do with it? So there is a concern there. In terms of who they have at Guantanamo, I have no idea, but this is Guantanamo became the showcase for detainee things. So originally in my head, this book was called The Petting Zoo, which is what one of the chapters is called. This is the window dressing, so that we'll bring people here. They brought, Carol Rosenberg was there constantly. They brought people, twice a week, a delegation of journalists arrived and stayed for 3 days. She got to stay the whole time and convinced them to let her stay the night in between, which was awesome. But the point is that it was a dog and pony show. You went there, they gave you the routine, they showed you this, they didn't show you this, and they got away with it. The press reported it this way.
To what extent has Guantanamo Bay been partly a huge PR exercise?
Without a doubt.
The American government, for its own domestic audience, to say we're actually really tough, and it backfired internationally because Americans didn't realise how bad it was going to go down with everybody else.
Well, I don't know if it was about we're being really tough. I think it was I think it was cosmetic in a different way. Look, we're giving them such good food. We're giving them, that way. And also, look, the ghost prisons around the world were the story. Bagram was the story. Abu Ghraib was the story. But we're all, but Guantanamo was where you could go and they would show you what they were doing and you're supposed to believe it. And so that was,
I mean, how can we believe Obama is actually going to clamp down on this when Bagram is going to remain open?
Well, okay, because it feels good. No, I don't think they've decided what to do about Bagram yet. I think it's a major problem, and that Bagram has many of the issues. I'm not being simplistic about this. Has the issues that Guantanamo had. We don't know who's there. We know 600 people are there. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they were picked up. We don't know whether they've been associated with specific crimes or not. We don't know whether they're from the battlefield. We don't know if they're Afghan. We don't know just what we used to not know about Afghanistan. And this information was requested during the end of the Bush administration. It was refused. And so we're living in a non-transparent place. Obama's made a commitment to transparency, and they're going to eventually have to get to Bagram. My guess is they're going to solve Guantanamo first, but it's not just Bagram. I mean, there are, and this is something I only hear of, so I don't know this in any, but there are these forward operating bases throughout Afghanistan. Maybe they have, maybe it's the story that they have prisoners there. So the prisoner story is not over. The detention story is not over, and that's why Obama's task force on detention is actually critically important. He was right. I can't close Guantanamo until I have a detention policy. For 7 years. Or 8 years, we refused. Guantanamo allowed us not to have a policy. That was no policy. And so that's a sign of hope, that there has to have a detention policy. And that detention policy will be about prisoners. It's going to have to be about prisoners everywhere, because these aren't American citizens that we're picking up. And so, I mean, that's just my optimistic guess.
There was another part of your question, which was, does it set a precedent for the UK or whatever? Yeah. My simple answer to this is, I hope not. Putting aside for a moment all the ethical and moral issues surrounding it, just be entirely pragmatic. To my mind, it's counterproductive, because it's poor counter-terrorism. Why? Because one of the key things that we need to keep the public safe is intelligence coming not only from the ether and from overseas, but coming up from communities. And in this country, we've always had the view that terrorism is a crime, terrorists are criminals, and they should be tried in the normal criminal process. Due process, transparency of due process, I think is hugely important if communities are going to have confidence in the objectivity and integrity of what's being done for them. So I think it's hugely important that we stick to due process, and part of that is, of course, about intelligence coming up from communities. But beyond that, if you just look at the results in courts in the last few months. Now, if we look at 2007, when the whole raft of trials started coming through, about 100 people were convicted that year. People were falling over themselves to plead guilty. Of the 100 or so people who were convicted that year, about 50 of them pleaded guilty, and the rest were found guilty. Juries were convicting on a regular basis. Suddenly, in the last 18 months, this has stopped. Even very strong cases with very good evidence, we would say, of juries have not been happy with them. Why is this? I think there's a combination of things. Part of it is general distrust of authority, etc., the damage done to anything called intelligence by the WMD issue, and all of that is now coming back. Distrust of government, but also the drip of knowledge that is coming out about what's happened around the world in terms of torture, rendition, detention. I think it's set up in the backs of juries' mind a distrust of what's being put before them, and I think that's part of the problem. So purely pragmatic grounds.
Just a minute. No, there's a lot of other people that want to speak, so you've had a good go. Gentleman here.
John Manell from the BBC. I've covered the Guantanamo story for the last 7 years and presented the programme How to Close Guantanamo a couple of years ago and interviewed Binyan Mohammed most recently, who has just been released. I've got a question for both of you, if that's okay. First of all, Karen, you mentioned Rick Backus, and I interviewed him, I think, in either 2003 or 4, and he was very bitter about what had happened to him. But then, of course, his replacement was then replaced by Geoffrey Miller, who himself was an interesting character because he was the man who was in charge of Abu Ghraib a few years later at the time of the photo scandal. But my understanding is that he was made both commander of the camp, but also of interrogations as well. Now, I don't know whether your book goes up to that
It
point,
does.
but why did that happen? Why was Rick Backus's replacement then replaced by Miller, and why was Miller chosen?
That's not exactly how it happens, but I understand why you would think that. What happens is this. Leonard is replaced by Backus, and Dunlavey comes in at the same time. So the Leonard command is split between, the command is split between Backus, who takes over the detention effort, but in a very minor role, and Dunlavey, who sets up the interrogation effort. And at that point, the detention effort becomes subservient to the interrogation effort because of the power structure itself. When the context in which you have to understand this, and it's actually amazing, is that Pete Pace was the head of Southcom and was taken out by Donald Rumsfeld immediately and put as deputy to the Joint Chiefs. Now, the reason that's important to your question is that there was no one in charge of Southcom for the entire time you're talking about.
Would you just explain what Southcom is?
Southcom is like CENTCOM, it's the area command that regulates Guantanamo. And it is between Guantanamo and the Joint Chiefs. And so it had the regulatory mechanisms, and they reported in, if you follow the right chain of command, up through Southcom. But there was no boss. So if you have no policy and so they put in somebody who had 2 stars, which meant nothing. It meant, and everybody, so what we would, it has to be a 4-star. By code, by everything, no command, no central command, combatant command, has anything but a 4-star. So they knew exactly what, there's just some coincidences that don't occur. Why is this important? Because when Dunlavey and Backus come in, Dunlavey considers himself on a par with the head of Southcom, which is his justification for why he's reporting directly to Rumsfeld. And when the new head of Southcom comes in, it is the longest, what do they call it? When they, when you approve somebody, confirmation hearing in the history of the military. And it takes forever, which I've never been able to get to the bottom of, but yeah, it's just coincidence. It takes forever, and so they still don't have this commander until they decide who's actually going to run Guantanamo. They had decided, Dunlavey doesn't know this, but they had decided not to leave Dunlavey, and he was way unstable. I'm sure he was put in to destabilize the place. There was no chance. When they took Backus out, they didn't replace him. There was a 2.5-week period where there was just Dunlavey, where very bad things happened, and people were worried, and people on the wrong side were worried. That's how bad it was. People who thought they would be responsible, held responsible for what happened. Jeff Miller is put in under Hill. Hill, the new head of Southcom. Hill is told under no uncertain terms by every single person at Southern Command who's working there, the first thing you need to do is unify this command. And he unified it as an interrogation mission because it was already an interrogation mission. The reason this is interesting is Abu Ghraib. It tells you that when Abu Ghraib happened, there was a model in mind. You have a split command, you have a detention effort, an interrogation effort, they'll go after each other, there'll be complete chaos, we won't know who to blame, and then the same and they pulled in Miller to unify it, which is, by the way, the military's story on Miller is what it meant to Gitmo-ize Abu Ghraib was not what we have all said, but that Gitmo-ize Abu Ghraib meant unify the commands. And while it was unify for the interrogation effort, the actual thing, if you get what I'm saying, was the unification. So I'm not trying to, that's just how they thought of it and how they justified it.
And perhaps no coincidence that it was Miller who was then in charge of
It's no coincidence. None of this is a coincidence.
Your second question.
The second question was just to say, I'm quite, I don't know, I won't say proud, but it's I've got a letter signed from Jeffrey Miller at home which bans me from Guantanamo. So
there you have it.
but Peter, you say that your officers weren't allowed into Guantanamo, but obviously officials from the intelligence and security services were allowed in to interview the British detainees. Did they? I assume that they then gave information to your officers. So, did they give any indication to your officers about whether they thought that information was useful or not?
No, not that I'm aware of. And I think the allowed in bit, we have to be absolutely clear. This was shortly before I took over command of the anti-terrorist branch, as then was. And I'm pretty sure it was a decision taken on this side of the Atlantic as to who would go. It wasn't a rebuttal from the other side of the Atlantic, as far as I'm aware.
Right, so it was the British who wouldn't allow your officers to go?
That's my understanding. But again, it was before I took over. In terms of the intelligence flow, I think it's important to understand, the security service has the statutory remit for intelligence gathering in this country, and of course the other parts of the intelligence world as well. It's fanciful to suppose that they come along to the police and say, oh, by the way, so-and-so's told us this, that, or the other. I mean, it doesn't work like that. There is intelligence that, and then the police will begin an investigation to find out whether there's actual evidence to corroborate or otherwise whatever intelligence leads there are. And that's the way, basically, in which all the major cases that I'm thinking of for the last 5 or 6 years have begun. Strand of intelligence about a group of people, an evidential investigation is then begun, and it either leads to arrest and prosecution or not.
Okay, sorry, gentleman there, and then you afterwards. Yes.
Robert Fox, I'll be quick because you've had a go at this. The IAS says, can we go to the beginning of the story and the first act of defiance, the ICRC? Karen and Peter, how do you judge their role? And is your story really a fable of American exceptionalism? That being so, where do the Geneva Conventions fit into this scenario? Are they fit for purpose?
Am I supposed to answer?
It's down to you, Karen.
Oh, well, thanks for that easy. You say you would be brief.
Far too difficult a question.
Okay. Where the ICRC fit in? They fit in because it meant that Guantanamo could not be hidden. So if Guantanamo was supposed to be an interrogation effort and they were suddenly there, the idea of invisibility was completely gone immediately. The role they actually filled was not unlike the Muslim chaplain. It was to interpret who these people were for a combatant command that was used to dealing with South America and did not know what Arab culture was, what Muslim culture was, what languages they spoke, knew nothing, what diseases they had. That was one of the big issues. And so they became the interpreters of the language, because we didn't have the right interpreters, because we thought they all spoke Arabic, which, whatever. And they became pivotal to sort of making requests to Mike Leonard. Having said that, Saif al-Islam, the chaplain I talked about, he actually got the more important request, at least from my read of it. And the detainees are very interesting when they talk about Saif. They're like, an American imam, we were going to trust somebody who worked for the military, and they say that. And that may or may not be true, but they had no choice but to use him, and they needed things. They were in pain, and I mean physical pain. They wanted certain things, both psychological and physical, and Saif was in there. And some of it had to do with sexual attitudes, and some of it had to do with nudity, and so there were a lot of things. And Saif, they may say they didn't talk to him, but the requests that he passed on for underwear and other things meant that they were talking to him about intimate details. And so, you know, it broke the idea of these guys isolated and far, and the ICRC is part of that. The Geneva Conventions. This is a huge concern, and I should just tell you, I just wrote this piece called The End of Human Rights or something. I got in so much trouble. All I was trying to say was that American exceptionalism in terms of things like the human rights movement is gone. And that, you know, now we're like everybody else. We've done the things that we were exceptionalist about, that sort of moral, if not exactly honest, exceptionalism about ourselves, at least at the state level, and that we've sort of given that up. I think that the push to change the Geneva Conventions, which now human rights advocates are talking about, to say that, yes, indeed, the terrorists are another, the transnational jihadi, et cetera, are a different category than we've ever had identified before and pose a different kind of threat, and therefore we need to revisit the Geneva Conventions, is very scary ground. Peter says, you know, they're criminals. They're criminals. You know, I mean, that's one way of viewing them, as criminals, the detainees, as enemy criminals, as a number of people have called them. And so once you go down the path of saying, well, we need to change this, do you not justify some of what the Bush administration did by saying, well, the laws didn't apply? Now, that doesn't justify them not vetting it and saying, let's change the law first, but it's very complicated, and I believe it's going to happen, that there'll be a protocol that will respond to international terrorism. But maybe Peter has a different idea. Do you have a different idea?
No, and frankly, the Geneva Conventions are not something on which I'm at all qualified to pass comment. You know, thank goodness within the M25 we haven't had to worry too much about the Geneva Conventions over the 30 years of my career. But I think the question about the ICRC is interesting, because although, again, it wasn't strictly within my remit at all, throughout those meetings there was frequent reference to the ICRC. The Foreign Office obviously did visit the detainees in a sort of consular role. And so to have the ICRC reports almost as a sort of third eye as well was very useful, I think, in terms of making representations about the treatment of individuals and saying, you know, so-and-so could do with more daylight or whatever, you know, at the time. And I think the Foreign Office genuinely valued the fact that the ICRC were there.
Gentleman here at the front and then the gentleman behind.
Angus Walker from ITV News. Question for Karen and a question for Peter, please. Karen, we've seen some evidence of former detainees become involved in terrorist activities once they've been released, notably in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia. What do you think the fallout, political fallout, will be for President Obama if that trend develops into anything much more significant? And for Peter, you touched on it, but can you actually try and quantify the level or amount of extremism that was fueled in this country by the mere existence of Guantanamo Bay?
Want a trade question?
I think it's hugely difficult to quantify. I mean, you only have to look at Contest 2 and then the UK government's counter-terrorism strategy and the amount of focus that is there on the prevent strand. There is that degree of focus because, frankly, I don't think we really understand all the dynamics of the radicalisation process, what it is that makes people you know, either vulnerable or determined to go down that particular path. I think it's quite impossible to quantify, but I have not the slightest shadow of a doubt that the sorts of things we've been hearing about over the last few years have added fuel to whether it's smouldering embers or fire. It's probably for others to judge, but quite clearly, you only have to look at some of the videos which various suspects have made. You know, if you think of the videos, you also have to be careful because the trial's still running, of the guys involved in the airline plot. You look at the anger that's there, and that didn't come from out of the ether. There's something that's fueled that. So I think it'd be foolish to minimise the potential impact of some of these issues.
On the issue, this is the hardest question to answer, and I get it from people like federal judges. So, Karen, what are you going to do when somebody attacks? Like I have any control. So I'll give you kind of the way, but I don't really buy any of them as convincing. One answer, and Peter can maybe like nod your head, like in terms of recidivism, even though this might not be recidivism, given the fact that 600 of the detainees are home and that we know of 2 instances and maybe 11 suspected instances, you know, the Pentagon eventually retract that list of 69 saying, well, you know, some of them were suspected because we thought they might have said so. It's really, it's not a bad, I know this is hard because, you know, we have zero tolerance for terrorism, and I totally share not wanting to be attacked or to have civilians attacked. However, in the hard, cold scheme of things, 2 out of 600 is just not that bad, and that's one fact. A second fact is we're not talking about releasing these guys to Yemen. If we were talking about releasing these guys to Yemen, which is the country even Saudi Arabia is worried about in those 2 we're talking about, then Guantanamo would be closed because we have 99 Yemenis, and that is the problem. That is the problem of Guantanamo, and they know it. No. And so what we're going to do with these Yemenis, and I've actually heard some actually creative and surprising things about where they're going, and it may not be Saudi Arabia, which we all thought. They're going to rehab in Saudi Arabia. There's no way to stop this, et cetera, et cetera. So on the issue, however, having said that, on the issue of risk, the risk of Guantanamo, and this comes along with what Peter is saying, forgetting the post-Guantanamo risk of who goes home. The risk of being in of having your brother, your son, your child, whatever, you know, in Guantanamo, and the anger that has caused around the world, and people talk about it, you know. I don't think this is just sort of a propaganda, or we're angry. You really think letting these guys out is going to make it worse? Maybe. Maybe when they get home because they're tortured and they're vegetables. I mean, this is a problem. A lot of these people are not functional. Al-Masri is the best example because people have had access to him. I haven't had access to Binyam Mohammed, but you know, I'd be curious what his state of mind is. And so I think this is about leadership. This is about somebody somewhere, which I have seen no evidence of this anywhere, getting up and in a public official and saying, you know what, we can tolerate some risk. This amount of these people may pose a risk, but we're going to charge our intelligence agents and our military and our whatever, and it's a risk. And we're not talking about that many people in the larger scheme of things. But do I think it's going to stop the possibilities for closing Guantanamo? Do I think it's a political argument that Obama may buckle onto? I think that's a very strong and maybe not politically unwise situation, but in the longer term of what needs to be done to redress what's happened at Guantanamo, it may be a very wrong thing. And let me just say one other thing. The window of saying we were wrong is going to disappear. This is Obama's Guantanamo now. Like it or not, it's his Guantanamo. And every day these people are there under the old rules, which is, you know, there without being tried, et cetera, et cetera. It's his Guantanamo. And so I think that window's disappearing. And if you want to make a statement by closing Guantanamo, close Guantanamo. And if you want to really make a statement, send people home. Anyway.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. A couple of questions for Karen. First of all, can you elaborate a bit on the Captain Yi, the Muslim chaplain affair? Why was he brought in and then drummed out? And the second question is on Bagram. I can understand that it's today being considered as a sort of alternative Guantanamo, but what was it in the early days? Because a lot of people were held there who were very low level. There was at least one death in custody through improper interrogation. Yeah. Nothing's happened about that. How did they decide that some people should be held at Bagram and some at Guantanamo?
This gets back to Peter's question. How did they decide who to send to Guantanamo? Beats everybody. There was no, and if you talk to some of the people and some of the interrogators have written about it, they said we just were trying to get people out of there. But the issue about Bagram is a good one. What has Bagram always been? There was more than one death at Bagram from abuse. I think that film Taxi to the Dark Side documents it, as does a lot of the New York Times coverage. There have been punishments for this within the military. I mean, it may not have been addressed at the higher level, but there are a number of people who have been, you know, discharged, imprisoned for those crimes. So it's not unattended. But Bagram has, the whole Bush administration is distraction. You know, if we were looking at torture, we knew something worse was going on. That's how we felt. You know, it's like so now. We took our eyes off of Bagram because we were focusing on other things. And we'll see when it comes. It's on the radar now, but how much it's going to be on the radar, I don't know. And we've never known very much about it. Amnesty International has an excellent report on Bagram. That's, you know, as their reports are, very detailed, very thoughtful, not particularly virulent in any way. I mean, it's a very balanced report that you might want to take a look at. And there was another part of your question. What was it that was interesting? Oh yeah, Captain Yi. So Captain Yi is the Muslim chaplain. I think he might have been 2 chaplains after my Saif. Yeah. What's great about Captain Yi is if you know about Saif, you realize that how well he was protected by Leonard. These guys develop a very strong tie, and it's their strategy that sort of runs the camp. But he is protecting, Leonard is protecting Saif every day from the troops who are ready to kill him for being talking to the detainees in this kind of sympathetic way. And he is accused constantly of treason, constantly. And he knows when Leonard leaves, he's said, everyone goes, and he's left there, and he is a worried man, to say the least, because the person who's running the detention effort under Leonard is now, in Mike Leonard's words, being put in his comfort zone, namely the interrogation effort and a detention effort that will support interrogation. And that's who my Muslim chaplain is working for. But all of the things that happen with Yi, the things he's accused of, have already been, this Muslim chaplain's already been accused of these things. It's just that he's protected. And he finally makes a deal with Rick Backus. He's like, I have to go. So the Yi thing, this was what they were going to accuse them of. I mean, a Muslim chaplain talking to these guys who tried to bomb the United States, who in their minds were involved in the Trade Center, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what was he doing talking to them? What do you mean ask them what kind of food they want or if their shackles hurt? Like, that was treason. And whatever else they were, bargaining with. And Yi paid for, he paid for Saif as well as for himself. And then he did some very foolish things and was able to be, I don't know, persecuted or what you want to say, because they had stuff on him because of just stuff he'd done. And it was a mistake. If you're going to be in that zone, you have to be very careful about how you behave, and he was not quite careful enough. So that's what happened.
Do we have any more questions? Possibly not. In which case, I would like to draw this meeting to an end. I'd like to thank you all for coming here. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and thank you to our two speakers, Peter and to Karen. Copies of Karen's book are available over there if you'd like to purchase one if you haven't got one already, and I thoroughly recommend that you do buy one. And thank you all very much for coming here tonight and taking part in this discussion. I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you. Bye-bye.